Whenever we hear any sound, we actually hear a combination of two separate things. We hear the original source sound itself, and we hear the space around it. To take an example, if we had the same violinist playing the same violin in a practice room, in a concert hall, and in a cathedral, the player and the instrument themselves would remain broadly the same. But the experience of hearing that music would be very different because the practice room and the concert hall and the cathedral have different acoustic properties. So whilst the instrument is the same, the space around them changes. What we're talking about is reverberation, or reverb for short. Reverberation, as its name suggests, is all about the way that sound moves around a space and bounces back off the surfaces of that space to reflect or reverberate certain frequencies within the sound being played. You can think about reverb as lots and lots of individual echoes. As a sound makes its way from the source sound into the room, it spreads out in all directions: left, right, up, down, front and back. Because sound is made from energy, as the energy spreads out into the room, it begins to die away. The first echoes to reach the listener are the loudest, as less energy has been lost. But the more surfaces each echo bounces off, the more energy is lost, resulting in ever-decreasing volumes for each individual echo. Because reverb is made from a large number of individual reflections, we don't hear each one as a separate echo. Instead, we hear a cloud of echoes reaching us for as long as it takes before the sound energy dies away completely. Depending on a room's size, shape, and the materials it's made from, reverb can hugely vary from one space to another. And as record producers and mix engineers have always sought out new sounds for the records they make, it's no surprise that they experiment with reverb as much as the source sounds which go into their records in the first place. You may know this already, but the main reason that recording studios are acoustically treated to minimize reverb reflections is because producers want to be able to add exactly the right type and amount of reverb to the sounds they record when they get to the mix. If sounds are recorded with a room's space as part of a source recording, it's not easy to cleanly remove it, limiting the scope for what can be done with that sound later on. So that's why individual instruments, particularly vocals, are nearly always recorded in spaces where reflections can be kept to a minimum. Sometimes, however, the sound of a particular space is a reason in itself to go and record there. The sound of Abbey Road Studio 1, for instance, is a popular choice for film composers because of the acoustic properties of that studio, the reverb of which has become the stuff of film soundtrack legend. So the first thing to say about reverb is that whenever you're making recordings, think about whether you're seeking to minimize reflections so that you have maximum choice later on, or whether you're finding creative spaces in which to record so that the natural acoustics of that space can become part of the sound of your mixes. But most of the time, because the tools available to us now sound so good, it's usually an advantage to record sounds as dry as possible so that we have maximum flexibility when it comes to adding reverb later on. These days, software reverbs broadly fall into two categories: algorithmic reverb and convolution reverb. Algorithmic reverb, as its name suggests, behaves a bit like synthesis, giving you a group of parameters to control how a reverb behaves artificially. You have control over the reverb time, how reflective a space is, how much frequency content is absorbed, and other parameters too. But crucially, the space you're building is made entirely synthetically, just like any sound you build with a synth. Convolution reverb relies on recordings of actual physical spaces to produce what's called an impulse response file. When you use a convolution reverb and load an impulse response, the reverb plugin convolves the source signal with the impulse response to produce your sound in that space. So you can think of an impulse response as a kind of silent file, which nevertheless contains the acoustic properties of a space ready to wrap around any source sound that you feed into it. The advantage of convolution reverb is authenticity. If you're allowed to go and record impulse response files in Sydney Opera House, Westminster Cathedral, the Taj Mahal, the Grand Canyon, or anywhere else, you'd effectively be able to bring the authentic acoustic properties of those places to your tracks. Think about what I said about Abbey Road Studio 1 a little while ago, and you can see why impulse response recordings appeal. Anyone could bring that sound to their tracks. What convolution reverbs lack, however, is flexibility and the freedom to automate their parameters. Effectively, every time you pass a sound through a convolution reverb, some processing time is required to convolve the resulting sound. Remember, that's the process of wrapping the source sound in the reverberant version of it. So if you decide to adjust the decay time of an impulse response file, it will need to be recalculated, interrupting playback. So there are pluses and minuses for using both convolution reverbs and algorithmic reverbs, but it's important to understand how both work so that you can make really sensible choices about which approach you want to take when it comes to adding reverbs to your own tracks. So far we've learned a little about the reverb which occurs naturally in a space when sound is played, and that studio engineers have often wanted to separate this from the source sound itself. If we understand that there are two separate parts to a source sound, we can learn two of the most important words we'll need when choosing and designing reverbs of our own: dry and wet. Dry sounds are source sounds detached from any reverb, the sound a singer produces in an acoustically treated vocal booth, for instance. And the wet sound is only the reverb, the reflections produced by a source sound, but not the source sound itself. As soon as recording engineers began to realise the potential advantage of being able to separate dry and wet signals, giving them flexibility over the volume of these two sides to a sound, they began experimenting with how to record the two parts separately. Before the technology allowed them to do this with dedicated reverb units, experimentation started with echo chambers. These are rooms or reverberant spaces. A dry recording would be made in a recording studio, where an amplified version of that recording would be sent into the reverberant space and recorded, using microphones, onto separate tracks, so that the amount of reverb could be blended separately from the source recording. The first technological-based reverbs were springs, as in spring reverb, and these sent vibrations through a metallic spring which would resonate in sympathy with the signal being passed through it. With a pickup attached at the other end of the spring, the characteristic slightly hollow overtones of spring reverbs proved popular, and they're still used a lot in dub music particularly. The next electromechanical reverbs came in the form of plates, literally sheets of metal which, like spring reverbs, vibrated in sympathy with the signal being passed through them. Either one or two pickups would then be used to capture the outgoing reverberations, producing mono or stereo reverbs respectively. Perhaps the biggest revolution in hardware reverb came in 1979 with the release of Lexicon's 224, the first digital reverb unit. Lexicon's name is synonymous with high-quality hardware reverb units, and through the 1980s a series of rack-mount reverb modules was released, the PCM range, which offered increased flexibility and audio quality with each new version. These algorithmic reverbs set the benchmark for what artificial reverb could be and began to introduce the parameters we continue to associate with reverb design, offering a flexible range of parameters to tweak the sound and behaviour of an imagined space to suit your mix. As soon as computers became powerful enough to host effects plugins natively, a giant swathe of software developers began to develop tools along the lines of Lexicon's pioneering hardware designs. So whilst no two software reverbs are quite the same, we tend to find that the same parameters crop up from one software plugin to the next. So of course it's going to be a massive advantage to learn what they are and what they do, so that when you're designing reverbs, you're able to kind of tailor the sound set options available to you to your tracks to make sure that the reverb treatments have as much care and attention spent on them as the sounds that you made in the first place to trigger those reverbs. Decay. This controls the reverb length. This simply means how long it takes for the reflections to completely die away to silence. When they do, the sound energy which triggered the reverb in the first place is completely run out. Many reverbs allow you to set decay times separately for high and low frequency content, with the option to choose the crossover point between these frequencies. Pre-delay. This is the time before the reverb begins. Most algorithmic reverbs allow you to set a time, either in milliseconds or clock to the tempo of your track, to delay the start of the reverb signal. This allows you to leave a gap between the source signal and the reverb itself. Damping controls. These let you change how different parts of the frequency spectrum reverberate. Damping is usually applied to high frequencies to roll off how bright and fizzy the reverb sounds, but low frequency damping can also stop reverbs becoming too big and washy. High and low EQ. Sometimes reverbs feature dedicated EQ sections which process the tone of the reverb produced. In other words, having made a reverb, the plugin then lets you EQ its tone. But sometimes the EQ is applied before the reverb, changing the tone of the source sound before the reverb is produced. Diffusion. Sometimes separate diffusion controls are provided for both early reflections and the main reverb portion of the treatment that you're building. Remember, each individual reverb reflection produced within a space is a separate echo. Diffusion controls allow you to bring these echoes closer together or spread them out to produce denser, smoother reverbs or livelier, springier ones. Density. This controls how thick a reverb sounds. The higher the density, the lusher and more full a reverb will appear. Lower density produces thinner, sometimes more clattery reverb effects. Mix dials or dry-wet sliders. These controls set the balance between the processed wet sound and the original dry sound. A single mix dial can be used to blend between these, or separate sliders can control the volume of each separate portion. Modulation controls. Reverbs sometimes contain internal modulation options. These usually introduce a low-frequency oscillator or other controller to change the behaviour of the reverb, perhaps introducing some pitch variation to simulate older vintage reverbs, or controllers to add width, depth and some chorus-like thickening. As well as modulation depth, you'll often find a rate control here to choose the speed of the movement that modulation brings.